We've been looking at world religions through 5 lenses. These lenses are the sacred, myth, ritual, community, and the individual. And so we're going to take that lens and apply it once to each of the first 5 religions, and then again, another aspect of those lenses to the second half. So we're in the first half right now. So we've looked at the sacred in Native American religions, we've looked at myth in Hinduism, we've looked at ritual in Buddhism, and now we're going to look at Chinese religions through the lens of community. Next week will be the individual, the notion of the individual in Zoroastrianism, which is a fascinating religion that not many people know about. It's a very small religion, but its influence is tremendous. All right, so let's get started and talk about community. So if you have looked at the videos online on our YouTube channel or been here, you know that we're moving through these lenses. These are 5 lenses, but they're kind of related. They kind of follow upon one another. So we talked about religion itself being an experience of the holy other. We talked about the sacred in terms of sacred time and space. We talked about myth as a story that's true because it's a story you're living out. We talked about ritual as putting the body in touch with the sacred. And now we're going to talk about community. And those things follow upon one another. As we see now that we're getting into the religions that have founders, like Buddha last week and some of the Chinese founders, there's a kind of progression where the founder has an experience, tells a story, does a ritual, creates a community. So that's what we're doing here. So what is a religious community? A religious community has 3 things in common. It may have more, but I'm emphasizing 3. Beliefs, and we can trace that back to myths, actually. Practices, and we can trace that back to ritual. And space, we can trace that back to sacred space. So, as I said, the religious community may try to replicate the founder's experience, but that's hard to do as time goes past, and the shift then becomes to the community itself rather than the founder. As time goes by, you lose access to the founder even through the myths. The myths and the sacred texts have to be renewed and reinterpreted for the sake of the community. So as I said, we saw how founders have this foundational, oh, that's a pun, isn't it? Founders, foundation, same word. They have this experience of the sacred. That's a dramatic experience. It's wholly other. So when Muhammad is in the cave and he hears Allah say, recite, that it was like nothing he'd ever experienced before. And so it produces a sense of awe and fear. When the Buddha fell into the river and woke up, literally and spiritually, that was like nothing he'd ever experienced before. It was brand new. It was radically new. It's not typically a warm and fuzzy feeling. It's a radical change in the world, in the way you see the world and the way you exist in the world. So what's required after that is some sort of reconnection. We talked about how the word religion etymologically has this sense in it of religare, to reconnect, because you can't, I mean, I guess you can, but it's really difficult to have the experience of awe and fear, this experience of the holy other, and then not do anything with it. Maybe you get taken up into heaven, awesome, but you're not here anymore, so we can't talk about it, right? You have to come back to the world. Joseph Campbell talked about this in The Hero's Journey. Once the hero experiences her, really what she experiences is her own death, and then flight from the gods, the last piece of the journey is coming back to the world. Typically what happens with the founder is that you get the first followers, and they are not many, because this is a radically new world you're trying to create. You're trying to create Islam in the middle of the Arabian desert that is polytheistic, it's idol worship, it's based on trade, it's a very commercialized religion, and you're trying to overturn that, and you're trying to say there is no God but Allah when you're in the midst of gods. It's a very difficult, and it doesn't matter what the religion is. Next week we're going to talk about Zoroaster, who I think was one of the greatest religious geniuses on the planet, and he took, a little bit like Muhammad, he took a polytheistic religion and made it into a monotheistic religion. And that does not sit well with anyone, because it's change. And it's not only change, it's not only cultural and social change, it's religious change. And religion is, remember, the meaning that matters most to us. So if you mess around with that, you're going to get in trouble. You might even get crucified. And so when the founder's there and his followers surround him, for Muhammad's first follower adherent was Khadijah, his wife. Zoroaster's first follower was his friend. It starts small, again, because it's a hostile environment. And so once the founder's there, same with Jesus, once the founder's there, it's like, oh, okay, well, I can just ask him. But when the founder dies, this is really the emergence of, or the beginning of religious community. Because sure, you have a community, but it's not communal. It's like the community you have at a rock concert, right? Did I just say rock concert? I just went back to 1970 for some reason. It's like this. Everything's focused one way. It's not a community, right? It's not people working together. So sure, that's a community, but it's all focused on the founder. When the founder dies, it's a crisis. We saw last week how in Buddhism, like the next day after the Buddha died, there was a conflict. And within a year, there were 4 sects of Buddhism, because they couldn't, these peaceful Buddhists couldn't decide what the Buddha meant. And then within 10 years, there were 16 different sects of Buddhism. This is the nature of religious community. It has to, replace, it has to deal with the loss of the founder. And it never goes well. It just doesn't, because the founder's not there to correct. And so who has authority, right? After the founder dies, people are like, well, I have authority. Really? Why do you have authority? Yeah. Well, I knew him. Well, I knew him too, dude. We broke bread. And so here you go. I don't have to explain this to you. You know how religious division is. So, the community then forms around this absence of the founder. And it is, as I said, a moment of crisis in the development of the religion. So there is a heightened concern about the nature of the community itself. And so what happens is internal litmus tests begin to emerge. Or as Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. You have to determine who's in, and you have to have some sort of test, and then you have to mark yourselves as different from everybody else. So there's an internal coherence that has to emerge, and that's usually based on ethics. And then there's an external demarcation that has to emerge, and that's usually cultural, unless there's another religion in the picture. So for example, we mentioned last time about the ancient Hebrews and their dietary laws and other laws. So there were strict rules against intermarrying, right? Because that would not keep the community coherent, right? If we let anybody in, then who are we? And that goes along with the internal litmus tests of don't touch this, don't eat that. Right? So it's all coherent, the internal and the external. That's the nature of a community. And ethics is what plays a role here. So sure, there's the founder, there are the myths, and again, I'm using myth not as something that's not true. In fact, I'm using it as something that is true, the stories. So it's the stories and then the stories' meaning. But you can't, most of the myths, well, all of the myths really, and most of the sacred texts are stories. Well, how do you form an ethics out of stories? You don't really tell stories to make ethics. You tell stories to make myths. And so the interpretation of the stories begins to coalesce, may coalesce in several places, different places, and then it becomes ethics. So remember, you can see this in the ancient Hebrews, and we'll see it. The ancient Hebrews were released from Egypt through the Exodus, the Passover, and that is the story. And tell this story to your children and pass it down. And by the way, thou shalt have no gods before me. You shall honor your father and mother, right? So you move right into ethics. You move right into these codes. Can be very strict and very legal because they're there, they're the mortar of the community. They hold it together because, again, internal litmus test, do you follow the dietary laws? External demarcation. We observe the Sabbath. That's how we're different from you. You out there. Right, so got ahead of my slide. Codification of ethics, rituals, and customs. Once this settling begins to take place, it becomes really easy to start adding things to it. So it's not only what the founder said, it's what the elders have done for years, right? And then that begins to take on the same aura of authority. So, and you see this in Chinese sacred texts. You see it in the Quran, where you have the Quran, but then you have the Hadith, the sayings about the Quran, right? The teachings about the Quran. You have the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but then you've got the Talmud, and you've got the Mishnah, and you've got all these commentaries on the sacred text. So the same thing happens in the community, is you start adding things, and they become solidified, and they look like they're sacred. And that stability in the text and in the rituals is the stability of the community. I have Durkheim down here. I don't want to inflict Emile Durkheim on you, but he was a sociologist, had an interesting point. He said that religion is society worshiping itself. Now that's a very complex notion, but on one level it's pretty simple. I mean, think about just what we've been talking about, the development of a religion and how it goes from this dramatic, unheard of, otherworldly experience to, oh yeah, don't eat that. Don't marry him. It just kind of comes down to something quite common, societal, custom. So religion is society worshiping itself. And I think all he means by that is that all that drama gets boiled down to something every day. And so the sacred becomes every day. And that's how we experience the sacred, frankly, now, as something that's every day. Did you go to church? Did you go to temple? Did you go to mosque? Did you do your prayers? Right? I don't want to imply that community is a bad thing. It is not. It is all we have after the founder's gone. It's all we have to hold us together. I'm just saying it's part of a development. So now, in the development of a religion, you form this community. It's always fragile because it's made up of people. And it's made up of people who are concerned with the meaning that matters most in their lives. And so there are going to be issues always. So that's internal. But now you've formed your community and you have to face your immediate culture and your nation and the world. Questions must be answered. For example, with the ancient Hebrews who go into the land of Canaan, growing up, as I did, listening to the hymns about the land of Canaan, I thought it was empty. I thought, oh, there was this land of Canaan, and the Hebrews just walked in, and it was flowing with milk and honey. No, there were people there, Canaanites, so it's like, oh, what do we do with them, right? They are not us. They are not the chosen people. Here's a question we need to answer. How do we deal with them? It's interesting, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, you have two separate answers to that. You have the book of Judges, which is, well, we wiped them out. So book of Judges is like, Joshua is like, we wiped them out. Joshua gets the command from Moses, and we're just going to wipe the slate clean. Judges is a little different. Judges is a little, the Canaanites have a little more pushback, and it's not an easy colonization. Anyway, there are negotiations that must take place because even if you're in a monastery, even if you seek to retreat from the world as much as possible, you are still in the world, right? You cannot avoid it. St. Augustine, in his great book, City of God, called Christians resident aliens. They were living here, but they were aliens because they belonged to heaven and to God's world, but they were here. You have to deal with the questions, and you have to make compromises. You do. You can try not to, and this is the retreat to fundamentalisms, right? So American fundamentalism was born in the 1920s. There's a reason for that. That was a time of great change in the Western world. It was the height of the Enlightenment, the height of science and technology for the time, the emergence of a new worldview. Freud had written Interpretation of Dreams in 1901. Everything was changing. And so the response is retreat. But it's not a simple retreat. So it's not monastic life where I just don't want to, I'm just going to try to get away from this. It's war with the world, right? So not just, I'm not going to be a part of this, I hate you and I denounce you for it. By the way, this is, for what it's worth, I'm sure we'll get to this with Islam, but I think every discussion of Islam I've had has missed this point. It's not Islam, it's fundamentalism that's the issue. And there's Christian fundamentalism, Buddhist fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, everywhere there's fundamentalism. So it's another slice that is not endemic to a religion. It's endemic to an approach to culture. Anyway, more on that in January when we talk about Islam. You can move forward into acculturation, even assimilation, but assimilation would make no sense because then the group would just be absorbed. So acculturation, where you try as a religious community to respond and adjust and compromise and change if necessary. I think of my friends at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowships who do this. They want to be an open community, which is an oxymoron, but not a terrible one. I mean, because paradox is a good thing. It's a good category sometimes. So they want to accommodate changes in culture. Most religions, however, are somewhere in between, right? They're just like trying to hold on to this past the founder's experience, the history of the religion, but mainly the community itself, because a community is a memory, right? It's a memory. That's what holds it together. Just like your identity as an individual is your memory, right? It's your unique experience. Anyway, we'll get into that next week. Most of them are trying to hold on to that and yet live now. I think I've mentioned this before, but I was always struck when I went to my friend Rabbi Bailensen's temple that one of the prayers was, "Oh God, teach us how to understand your word given 3,000 years ago in a desert across the world. Help us understand how that applies to us today." Right? So there it is, acculturation. I'm not going to try to force that language, those rituals, those worldviews that were born in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. I'm not going to try to force that here and now, because it's not going to work, unless I'm a fundamentalist, and then I'm going to try to make it work by going to war. All right. So there are a lot, as you know, there are a lot of contemporary challenges to religious communities. There are, of course, I think the rise of women's rights has been one of the most dramatic challenges to many religious communities. And again, this is an example where the culture shaped the religion. So there's no real religion, major world religion, who said, you know, women are equal to men. The Buddha kind of did that, but then, of course, in practice, it didn't come out that way. He did teach that men and women both could become enlightened. But it just didn't happen. That's because culture had its hand on the religion, right, and wasn't going to let that happen. There was the two great awakenings in the United States in the 18th century, which was amazing. I still don't quite understand it, but there was revival, old-time revival in the United States, and it just swept through. People were being converted to Christianity. They were speaking in tongues. They were giving their possessions away. They were following the gospel. They were joining together, men and women, slaves and free. And guess who stopped that? Plantation owners, right? Who would go to the services and see the transformation, but then come back and say, you know, I just can't see you as an equal. So the real challenge for a religious community is that it has to deal with that unseen order, right? So it can't just be, hey, we believe this, and here's the data for it, and so we're going to do this. There's no data for the unseen order. It's unseen. It's felt, it's experienced, but you can't really argue for it, especially given the constraints of contemporary rhetoric, which is about data or about whatever. It's a really difficult challenge to hold a religious community together. Seems like it's harder today. And now, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting old, but everything seems harder. I don't know. All right, let's move to Chinese religions now, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So the earliest Chinese religions were something we've seen before, based multiple gods and spirits. Early scholars of religion would call it animism, the belief that the world itself had a soul, that it was animated, that these gods controlled the universe. This is not that different from Greek religion, ancient Greek religion. Right, God's concerned with the heavens and the earth, rituals to appease these gods, to ensure fertility of the soil or particular harvests. Remember, we talked about James George Frazer and the Golden Bough, and how he talked about this was the religious stage of culture, where you think through ritual that you can manipulate nature. It's a kind of technology, in fact. One of the most persistent elements of Chinese religion seems to be this, which you know, I'm sure. You may even have a tattoo of it somewhere. The Yinyang. We recognize this symbol. I think Westerners, I know I did when I first saw it and thought about it, focused on the line, the curved line, and the differences. But the emphasis is actually on the circle, the unity, right? Not the difference. And so yin and yang are about the balance of the universe. And in fact, I believe it's not even separated. I believe the word is yin yang. So it's like we're not even going to pull it apart and treat it as two things. It's one thing. So, and again, as Westerners, we don't want to lay too much on this. Yin is the negative force, but that's not negative. We tend to associate that with sin, judgment. It's not that. It's just a polarity, right? Darkness, coolness, femaleness is yin. Yang is the positive force. Again, this is not virtue. It's just the positive pole. Brightness, warmth, maleness. Again, maleness gets the bright part. Sorry. And everything in the universe is this combination, this balance. This is really important because this notion carries through to Chinese religion to this day. This notion of harmony, of balance, of equanimity, recognizing difference but transcending it, right? For the sake of order. All right. So we didn't talk about African religions, but if we had, we would have talked about ancestor veneration because that's found in sub-Saharan African religions. But it's really prominent in Chinese religions. And this is, again, I don't even like that term, veneration, because it implies some sort of deification of the ancestor, and I don't think that's right. I think it's a kind of deep respect, but also a recognition of the power and wisdom of the ancestors. I think that's probably a better way to put it. For example, we're going to talk about Lao Tzu in a minute, who was actually named Li Pu Yang, but his appellation was old man or old boy, right? Old boy. So old becomes not a temporal designation, but a designation of respect. The parents are revered while they're alive, but also after they pass. Divination, another important aspect of Chinese religions from the beginning, as far as back as we can tell, to even now. Again, if you believe in order, if you believe in balance and harmony and everything kind of working together for good, then you ought to be able to predict that in some ways, right? And so the notion of divination is here. Divination is in other religions in other parts of the world too. It's very prominent in Chinese religions. They would use the shells of tortoises, for example, or stalks of grain. So you'd throw down stalks of grain and see what pattern they made and then read the pattern. Or tortoises were used because they had a long life. And so that was, again, revered. And so you'd heat the tortoise shell until it cracked and then read the cracks, right? So you may know about the I Ching, where divination reached its peak. The Book of Changes, still used a lot today. We have one in the library, or in the bookstore, I just checked. We have many in the library. So yeah, there's this sense of, those are some of the old ideas of Chinese religions that have persisted, all right? The sense of the respect for age, whether the person's living or has gone on. the notion that the world is balanced, yin-yang, and the sense of being able to predict. And again, I hesitate because it's not about prediction. It's not, a horoscope. There's an ethical component to it. So it's not just divination for the sake of, oh, let's see what's going to happen. It's what should I do, right? So there's an ethical dimension. Isn't that a great sculpture there? That's Lao Tzu. I was talking about rising out of the earth there. Founder of one of the major religions of China, Taoism. The T is pronounced as a D. Sometimes you'll see it written as a D. Again, last time we talked about Buddha and legend, and these are great stories surrounding these people. By the way, Lao Tzu is living probably around that time, 6th century BCE, same as the Buddha, same as the Hebrew prophets, same as Plato and Socrates, right around in there. One of the reasons Chinese religions developed the way they did was societal, political, governmental problems, right? So just for example, and related to what we were talking about earlier, the development of a religious community, the earliest records we have of China are of the Shang dynasty that had a kind of patron, the Shang Ti, and they were, about these ancient practices of veneration, divination, balance, harmony, etc. The Zhou dynasty appears, overtakes the Shang dynasty, and makes the Shang Ti a god, a supreme god that must be worshipped to the exclusion of all the other gods, right? And that happened in concert with the overturning of the feudal system. So a lot of Confucius and Lao Tzu's premises are based on a feudal system, and that's the prince, the vassal, and serfs, and working the land, and tribute going up, and protection, and a way of making a living coming down. That was overturned, as it always is, by the way. And Lao Tzu was apparently, again, we're talking about legend, but I love legends. He was a archivist in the Zhou dynasty, in one of the courts. So he was recording this upheaval in his culture. Right? He was watching the feudal system turn upside down. So people who had worked the land were now moving into cities and selling things, and the wealthy, the aristocracy was losing money and had no power anymore. It was chaos, and so he left. He was recording all this, and he's like, I can't do it, so I'm going to leave. So the legend is that he tries to leave through the northwest passage, and the guard recognizes him. How he would have recognized him, who knows, but it doesn't matter, it's a good story. And he says, hey, you're Li Puyang, you're Lao Tzu. He says, yeah. He's like, I can't let you leave, we need your wisdom. And so I need you to write down your wisdom before I let you pass. So what he wrote was the Tao Te Ching, which is translated, apparently very difficult, with great difficulty, into English, which the most rudimentary meaning is the way. The Tao is the way. But sometimes, I think Ursula Le Guin translated it as the most excellent way and its power, or the power of the way and its virtue. So it's that sense of not just a way, but the way that is both difficult and rewarding. Here's my favorite portion of it. It's usually rendered in poetic form. It's just 81 little chapters. I'll be honest with you, it's a book that's influenced me more than anything, I think, the Tao Te Ching. And this is, honestly, when universities ask for my teaching philosophy, I quote this, partly to see how cool they are, see if they know what this is. If you overesteem great men, the people become powerless. If you overvalue possessions, people begin to steal. The master leads by emptying people's minds and filling their cores, by weakening their ambition and toughening their resolve. He helps people lose everything they know, everything they desire, and creates confusion in those who think they know. Practice not doing, and everything will fall into place. Yes. I could live off that for the rest of my life, right? Because I think everything you need to know is right there. And there's more of that. There's 81 of these. And they're brilliant and difficult. One of the sayings from the Tao Te Ching is, the world is perfect. It doesn't need changing. I still struggle with that one. But I know what he meant, right? Is that just be in the way. That's all you need to do, just be in the way, and everything will take care of itself. Practice not doing. The second most translated book in China after the Analects of Confucius, very close to the translation of the Bible. So it's a very popular book worldwide, has been for a long time. A lot of people here in the West don't even know about it. Now, again, this is like the original teachings of the Buddha in Deer Park. This is one thing. This is the original experience of the founder, the original teachings of the founder. As time goes on, the founder is gone, something has to take his place. And so later Taoism takes Lao Tzu's emphasis on living well and makes it into living long. Okay? And so Taoism gives birth to alchemy, among other things, and it starts to develop gods. Now, there's no deity in the Tao Te Ching, just as there's no deity in the Buddha's, the Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha. There's no deity there. The Buddha never claimed deity. Lao Tzu certainly didn't. And yet, Buddhism develops gods. Taoism develops gods. One of its gods, I believe his name was Sao Chun, the god of the stove. Why would there be a god of the stove? Because they were alchemists. They were always at the stove cooking things up, Some later Taoists were known to eat gold because gold exists forever, it's permanent. And so I want to live forever, so I'll eat gold. Alchemy was used to extend life. Still very popular, very different. Like I said, it developed gods, it shifts from well-being to long-being, to living long. Then, of course, we have Confucius. Westernized name, of course, like many things in world religions. He was actually called Kung or Kong, and his disciples called him Confucius, which is an appellation, master, teacher. Excuse me. Born, we think, 551 to a wealthy family. One of these families who had become poor, a wealthy family who was a victim of this overturning. I believe I remember his father was 70. I think this is right. I'm pulling this from somewhere. His father was 70 when he was conceived and died before he was born. You want to do a study sometime, do a study of the broken homes of the founders of world religions. It's there every time. I put that in quotes, broken homes, so not the nuclear family that you might think. Confucius, like Lao Tzu, was very interested in government. And so, again, there, in China, this religious community is kind of expanded into the national sense, or at least the provincial sense. And Confucius was, his virtue, or his equivalent to the Tao, or the way, was Li. Again, very similar. The course of life as it is intended to go. Yeah, okay. So there's this sense of not pushing against the world. The world is sacred. It doesn't need changing, right? But at the same time, you cannot give in to your baser desires. And that's what Li is. It's about being in tune, being in touch, being in harmony, being in balance. He taught there were 5 basic relationships in life. Father-son, by extension, parent-child, elder brother, younger brother. I was talking to my elder brother today. Yeah. Husband, wife. All right, yeah. Elder junior. I think of Dr. Harris, actually, who... and his mentorship, not just to me, but to so many people that I haven't even met. Ruler, subject. Okay, so that would be 5 basic relationships for that time in China. We should pursue Zhen, or love and good-heartedness. So, you know, this is why Manly P. Hall and Joseph Campbell and all the great wisdom thinkers were kind of trying to call our attention to this. You know, there's a lot of similarity at the core of world religions. For example, you know the golden rule that Jesus taught, right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Except that wasn't Jesus. You know who said it first? Confucius. Because it works. It works. I can take you from the golden rule of Jesus, the golden rule of Confucius, to the Navajo Pueblo feast in Acoma Pueblo, in Laguna Pueblo, that occurred because one time long ago, the Navajos came in to steal food because they were starving. And the Laguna said, hey, don't steal, let's not have a fight, let's make a feast. And that's been going on for decades, right? Do unto others as you would have others. There's this core. Now, we don't want to try to define it too sharply or make a kind of ethical code and say you're out, you're in based on this core, but, you know, that's what Manly P. Hall and other people in this wisdom tradition and what our school is about. It's like, you know, there's some basic stuff that's right because it works. All right, here into that sermon. I'm sorry I got off on that, but you might be interested in religion in China today. 1949 is a signature year in Chinese history. You know why? It was the birth of the Cultural Revolution and the death of a lot of Chinese people and Chinese religion in many ways. This was the Communist Revolution, essentially, and religion, of course, was forbidden. A lot of bad history, starvation, etc. You can research that on your own. So you can see that right there. See where the chart begins at 1950 and starts going down. That's Chinese folk religion, that top line. But you see here, all these religions have started rising again. And, you know, I don't pretend to know enough about Chinese culture and politics to offer a reason, but I would suspect it has something to do with capitalism, the reluctant embrace of capitalism by the Chinese government, which requires, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a noble thing, it just requires you to participate in trade more. There is still persecution of Christians. Notice, too, there's a strong Muslim contingent in China, still, always has been. And Buddhist. I didn't even mention Buddhism, but Buddhism is is a prominent religion in China still. And I'll say this in closing so we can get to some questions. We're going to talk at the very end about eclecticism in religion, where you can just bring in different religions and they can not only peacefully coexist, they can thrive. That's China. So Buddhism, Taoism, Chinese folk religion, all kind of work together nicely there. There's a story about an emperor who asked a scholar, "Are you a Buddhist?" And he pointed to his Taoist hat or something, and said, "Oh, so you're a Taoist?" And he pointed to his folk, or Confucius, I forget where I am in the story. He kept pointing to different aspects, different religious markers that he had on him to show that these were not in conflict for him. This was eclecticism. In fact, they even share the same shrines in China. Buddhists and Taoists will share the same shrines. So it's a really remarkable example of eclecticism, what we call eclecticism. And I think that's consistent with what China has always been about in terms of religion, is this blending, harmony, balance, and goodwill. All right, thank you for your attention. Any questions or comments about anything? Yes, ma'am.
And in the Tao, in the last lines, it says that the person should do nothing.
Yes.
How do you do that?
Indeed. How do you do that? This is, I'm going to speak as if I know, but I believe it's very much related to the Buddhist concept of attachment, so that if you are emotionally, spiritually invested in something, then you're about to be disappointed, right? Whether it's a church, a school, a family member. So I think it's about attachment. So of course you have to do, but I don't think you have to do with attachment, with the meaning of your life invested in it, right? That's how I read it. I wish I could just read you the whole Tao. And it is poetry. I would recommend, if you're looking for it, to get Stephen Mitchell's translation. Stephen Mitchell's a great translator who has done a lot. He's done the Bhagavad Gita, he's done the Book of Genesis. And the first time I came across him was his version of the Divination. And he's very careful to balance male and female. So here we have the master being a he, but in the next chapter it will be she. And that's appropriate for the Tao, right? Because it's the Yinyang. It's not what we think of it as. It doesn't have judgment in it. It just has polarity. And so, of course, it should be balanced. Anyone else?
Confucius, so that is a religion.
Oh, great question. I meant to mention this, so thank you for asking. The question is Confucianism a religion? Is Taoism a religion? Because there's no God. This is what I talked about in the first lecture, how Western scholars missed religion, and you'll still see it. Confucianism is not a religion, it's a philosophy, right? Taoism, early Taoism, the same thing. You can make that argument, but then, again, if we go back to our definitions that we talked about at the beginning, I think you were here at the very first one. William James, religion is about an unseen order and aligning ourselves thereto because that's our supreme good. Oh, well, that's Confucius, right? There's Li. There's this unseen order, and if we follow it, we'll live in harmony. Same thing with the Tao. This sense of something bigger beyond us that is also better than us or more powerful than us. That's religion. If you use that definition, it absolutely is. If you use a definition like early anthropologists and missionaries and travelers did, that it must have a deity, not going to be there. Taoism will eventually. So then what do you do with the religion, the early Taoism. If later Taoism's a religion, then early Taoism isn't. So you get into those kinds of questions. Also, the other criterion was, do you have a book? Do you have a sacred book, like the Bible? Well, the Tao Te Ching's not like a Bible, really. I mean, one of the first chapter has a line, darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. You're like, whoa, really? So it doesn't have the flavor of a sacred text. The Analects are really Confucius' teachings to his students. So they were like this. If somebody wrote this down, it would be really sad, wouldn't it? And then the disciples kind of added their thing. So is that a sacred text? No. But is it a myth? Yes. Right? Is it a story that people enact? Oh, yeah. In fact, the Chinese government for a while required the Analects as a civil service test. So it's really interesting. We live in America, which for the moment does not have an established religion. But we have separation of church and state. But that's never been the case in China. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say never. But yeah, I mean, you have the teachings of Confucius as part of your civil service exam. So if you want to work for the government, you've got to know Confucius. That'd be cool, right? Interesting. So again, in China, there's this religious community gets expanded into politics and government. I find that absolutely fascinating. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
You said that the Chinese gazed inward,
Yes.
focused religiously on domestic balance and harmony. How did they gaze inward?
Oh, that's a great question. Because they were generally closed off. China was a culture that was closed. They're not looking outward to the world. They're looking inward. Well, they don't. It's kind of the opposite notion of Europe, who has Da Gama, Christopher Columbus, Magellan, all these people going out. I mean, they did that, but they didn't come to the West. They went to Japan, for example. Yeah.
But being closed, like sealed borders in a way,
Yeah.
was that good or bad for China? Because I can see it from both angles. It has the advantage that you don't have these outside influences that can bring disorder.
Sure.
But at the same time, you're not exposed to whatever new things that is good that they have discovered.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know enough to answer that, but it's a very good question. I'm sure you could make both cases. So yes, they were closed, they were not interacting with the rest of the world, and yet they collapsed, and that's what produced Confucius and Lao Tzu. That's how Buddhism took hold there, is that system collapsed. So it wasn't an external influence that did that. It was all internal. At the same time, we can look at Europe as an open system, an open culture that had its own problems, right? With going out and people coming in and a lack of coherence. So, yeah, you should write a book and answer that question. That's a really good one. Yes, sir.
Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the Four Agreements.
Uh-huh.
Are you maybe familiar with that? But I think I don't think it's Tao or Tao. But
no, it doesn't include that. It's
another one. It's another word that's similar, but it's not this similar. It's not this.
Right.
I think it's Toltec.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That would not be a religion. Maybe it's also a way of life.
Right. I don't know the book you're referring to, but yeah, I mean that's kind of the point of the wisdom approach, is that you can go to what'd you say, Toltec, or you can go to the Toltecs, the Aztecs, certainly the Maya, the Inca, or you can go across the world to China, and there's something at the center of both. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't hear the author at the beginning. Yes, ma'am.
Really good question, but it might be kind of dumb.
Nope.
You were just mentioning that defining a religion would have some kind of a sacred book, or believe in some kind of a god, or pray or worship some kind of a god. And if, like, say, in Confucianism or Taoism, which doesn't have that, they don't have any sacred book, that would not be a religion. So your definition of a religion would be a sacred book of some sort.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
And a god.
No, not mine. No. Thank you for clarifying that. I'm saying that was originally, when the study of religion developed in the 19th century, it was based on anthropology and missionary reports, especially. And missionaries, of course, were looking into the mirror, not through the window. And so they wanted to see a God and a book. And so James George Frazer, for example, whom I mentioned in The Golden Bough, did not leave his office in England. He never went. He depended on these reports. And so religion then became, well, if you don't have a deity, preferably one, and if you don't have a book, you're not a religion. I'm saying that's wrong. I'm saying we missed most of Asia because of that.
And so then today, would you say Taoism or Confucianism as a religion?
Yes. Right, because it fits the definitions of religion. And we talked about this the first night. So one of the definitions is Paul Tillich's, that which is of ultimate concern. So it broadens the definition appropriately, and yet it narrows it enough to work. So if you are a Los Angeles Rams fan, then I feel for you. But you can make that a religion. You can make that your ultimate concern. I mean, a few people do with sports. But Confucianism offers a vehicle for ultimate concern, right? How to live well. That's an ultimate concern for sure. That's not some niche thing. Thank you. That is real. Taoism's the same way. Yeah. Does that answer? Yeah. I'm so glad you asked me to clarify that. I'm saying that's where we went wrong in the study of religion, is by limiting it to deities and books. Do you have another question?
Could you emphasize more about codification?
Yep.
Thank you.
I'm trying to see how much I should have. Codification simply means to make codes of. Well, why do you need codes, right? You need codes because life is fluid and changing, and codes stay the same. And codes are associated with writing. We're going to talk more when we talk about myth again, about the nature of oral cultures versus literate cultures. And literate cultures are cultures with writing. So if you're trying to create something that's permanent and you have the technology of writing, boom, make a list of 10 commandments and stick it up there, and there's your code. It looks permanent, and so it feels like it's a rock in the river, like the river flows around it, like time flows around it, but this is always going to be. Now that's an illusion, ultimately, but it sure feels good when you feel like you're going through the rapids and you don't know which way is up, and there's this boulder. You know, if I can just get to that boulder. That's what a code does. It also defines you, because there are all kinds of codes. And this is my code. This is my boulder. And there's only so much room on my boulder, by the way. And so I'm going to use my boulder to call it my space, and you're not welcome there. And then you know where that goes. Inside, outside, right? Good discussions. I love the discussions we have here. All right. Any other questions before we go? You're about to tell me. Oh, let's go ahead.
The last one. In the second, in this, I don't know how to call it in English, in the second section, where it says, by weakening their ambition, but it says, and toughening their resolve. Yeah. What do they mean? Developing self-willpower, or what is?
Yes. Yes. Isn't that a great line? There's a reason this is put in poetic form. It's very poetic. So you can see those lines there. They play off each other. Weakening ambition, toughening resolve, right? That's classic poetic form. So I shouldn't be ambitious because that's about me and that's about my ego. But my resolve, that's not about me. You can't see my resolve. That's inside. So I need to toughen that because that's in the way. Ambition is not in the way. Does that make sense? Ambition is seeking praise and glory. Early Taoists and even later Taoists really hated that. They hated celebrity culture, we would call it. They just wanted you to be tough and determined. And you're supposed to ask what we're doing next week. Okay. So next week is Zoroastrianism. You may not have heard of this, but I guarantee you know it already, because it's a little religion, again, around the time of the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, only this time it's in Persia, which is today called Iran. Very good. What a good group. So it's a Persian religion, still in existence, just barely. Recently, the target of Daesh, or ISIS, terribly persecuted by ISIS. But, well, if you have an idea of heaven, hell, salvation, you got it from Zoroastrianism. There's your hook for next time.